Before starting the story, let us know where you're watching from and what time you're watching. The Coffin That Breathes. It started with a whisper, a hush of air, like a sigh, slipping through the cracks of an old wooden box. At first, it was dismissed as a trick of the wind, a settling of wood in an aging house, but those who lived near Black Hollow Cemetery knew better. They had heard the tales, spoken in hushed voices over candlelight, about the coffin that breathes. James Halloway never believed in such things. A seasoned journalist, he had spent the past decade debunking supernatural myths, exposing hoaxes, and revealing the truth behind urban legends. When the legend of the breathing coffin reached his ears, he laughed it off, dismissing it as another ridiculous fabrication meant to spook gullible locals. But then came the letter. An old, weathered envelope arrived at his office, its corners brown with age. No return address, no postage stamp. Only his name, scrawled in ink that had bled slightly into the parchment. James Halloway. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing an urgent plea. The coffin is real. It breathes. I hear it every night, whispering secrets that should never be spoken. It wants someone. I think it wants me. Come before it's too late. The letter was signed, Margaret Eldridge. James's curiosity was piqued. He had heard of Margaret before, a reclusive woman who lived near the cemetery's edge. Some called her mad, others claimed she was cursed. But her story intrigued him. That night he packed his bag, grabbed his camera and notebook, and set off toward Black Hollow. The cemetery was ancient, its tombstones leaning like weary souls burdened by time. The fog curled around the graves, caressing them like a lover's embrace. Margaret's house stood at the far end, a small, crooked structure, its windows dark. He knocked, and after a long moment, the door creaked open. Margaret stood before him, frail and trembling, her face ghostly pale. "You came," she whispered, her eyes darting to the cemetery behind him. "It knows you're here." James hesitated. "What knows I'm here?" She grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "The coffin. It will show you, but you must listen." She led him to the graveyard, stopping before an ancient, unmarked tomb. A wooden coffin sat partially unearthed, its surface warped and splintered with age. James felt a strange pressure in the air, as though the world around him held its breath. Then, from within the coffin, a sound soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. A breath. James staggered back. His pulse quickened as the whispering began. Words, faint but distinct, slithered from the coffin's cracks. "James Halloway, help me." His skin prickled. "Who's there?" Margaret shuddered. "It speaks only to those it chooses. Listen, it has waited for you." James leaned closer, his rational mind warring with the terror creeping through his veins. The breathing grew heavier, desperate. A voice, soft, broken, murmured, "Let me out, please." James's hands trembled as he reached for the coffin lid. He hesitated. The whisper turned urgent. "Help me. It's dark. So dark." Margaret grabbed his wrist. "You must not open it. That's how it spreads." "How it spreads?" he demanded. Her lips trembled. "The curse. The suffering. The thing inside isn't a man anymore. It's something else. It needs a host to escape. If you open it, you become it." James recoiled. He had uncovered many deceptions in his time, but this felt different. Too real. Too raw. But the voice from inside the coffin wept now, a sorrow so deep it cut into his soul. What if Margaret was wrong? What if someone was trapped inside? The night stretched on, filled with whispers and torment. The coffin breathed in slow, shuddering gasps. James faced a choice: open it and risk whatever horror lay inside, or walk away, forever haunted by the unanswered cries. Then, the coffin exhaled one final time. A long, rattling breath. The whisper ceased. The air grew still. James turned to Margaret, but her face had gone slack with terror. Behind him, the coffin lid began to lift. A skeletal hand, blackened and twisted, emerged first, followed by an arm clad in tattered burial cloth. A voice rasping, ancient, yet filled with hunger, croaked, "You set me free." James stumbled backward, his mind screaming for reason. The figure within the coffin pulled itself upright, a withered corpse, its eye sockets hollow, but somehow aware. It turned its head toward James and smiled, an expression that should have been impossible with its rotted lips. Margaret shrieked. "Run!" but James couldn't. His body was paralyzed, his mind ensnared by the creature's gaze. The thing inside the coffin took a shuddering breath, and the air around them grew thick, suffocating. It stepped forward, its bones creaking, and the ground beneath them trembled. "You brought me back," it rasped. "Now, take my place." Darkness surged from the coffin, wrapping around James like a suffocating fog. He gasped, but the air turned to dust in his lungs. His vision blurred, his body convulsed. He felt something pressing into him, invading him, rewriting his very being. Marbert sobbed, backing away. "I warned you. I warned you." James tried to scream, but the sound never came. His last sight was the creature's grin widening as it stepped past him, free at last. Then, the world collapsed into blackness. When James awoke, he was no longer standing. He was lying down, enclosed, the weight of a wooden lid pressed against him. The walls were tight, unyielding. Then, he understood. He was in the coffin, and he was breathing. Somewhere above, a whispering voice filled the air, a new plea, a desperate cry. "Let me out. Please, it's so dark." And outside, the newly freed figure of James Halloway, no longer himself, walked away into the night, leaving the coffin behind, waiting, breathing, for its next victim.